Bonjour, bienvenue à
So welcome to all of you for this roundtable for sustainable and healthy food. I'm Aurélien Vers, the head of La Provence, and I'm with Akiko Suwa Eisenman, member of the Cercle des Économistes. She's prepared this session with us. We have Sophie Berlon, chairwoman of the Sodexo's board, France Cavalier, Economic Research Director at AgroParisTech, Jean-Philippe Puig, Chief Executive Officer of Avril, Mohamed Aziz Bouedja, President of Sustainable Farming Association in Tunisia. We're going to talk about healthy food, healthy environment. Akiko, you wanted to introduce the topic? Thanks a lot. Mens sana in corpore sana. A healthy body, a healthy soul, and this is what we are experiencing here at X. So why not start with healthy food? What does it mean, healthy food? So we know what is good healthy food to health. Food would be distributed with fruits and vegetables, healthy diet, and carbohydrates, 10% of dry pulses and 15% of proteins, of animal proteins, and the rest animal fat. And of course, we should reduce our alcoholic consumption, reduce the sugar and salty content in processed products. In order to protect the environment, we should focus on vegetable proteins, on dry pulses, and we should fish without exhausting the fishing stocks. It's a broad framework, but we need to look at the foods, how they are transported, processed, managed, and handled. So there are some healthy and environmental issues, but we need to focus on social dimension. When it comes to food, so the farmers shouldn't work in difficult conditions. You have to take into account the workers in farming, and their conditions of work shouldn't be impaired. So how can we get a healthy and sustainable diet? Allow me to talk about two avenues. Healthy diet will focus on fruits and vegetables. They provide fibers, vitamins, minerals, but fruits and vegetables are much more expensive as starchy foods, and it's not easy to get them. And the latest report on nutrition in the world by the FAO and other bodies said that a healthy diet would be $3.5 per individual and per day. So it is out of reach of many people. It is above the poverty line. So it is out of reach for 3 billion people in 2020. And underprivileged populations, they cannot afford to get a healthy diet, and they are located in poor countries, but also in France. There's a genuine risk of a food divide. This is something that is being highlighted. So nutritional inequalities, food divide should be taken into account according to the expert group of the United Nations working on healthy diet, talking about nutritional inequalities. So food is not simply a matter for the consumers, it's a matter for many food players, from the farm to the plate. So for some countries, such as African countries, it's important to waste less land and less water. So it means that there will be an intensification of production in order to get better yields with equal resources, lesser resources, or resources that are used in a better way. Agri-farming has been able to produce cheap foods. Complying with hygiene conditions should get a step further in order to integrate the imperatives of a healthy and sustainable diet. These choices are not easy because you have lots of players with divergent interests. To inform and to educate the consumers, that's not enough, according to an expert's report that was unveiled at the European Commission, advocating more binding measures such as a tax on bad products or a subsidy being given to good foods. It's a matter of regulating advertising or regulating the composition of processed foods. What are the priorities? How can we start with that? And what are the principles of a healthy and sustainable diet? Thank you. Sophie Bellon for Sodexo. So what is at stake regarding a healthy and sustainable diet? Thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm delighted to be with my co-panelists. It's a very important topic. So food goes beyond feeding oneself. It's a social bond. This is something that we've witnessed during the COVID period. People were frustrated. Food is also a matter of enjoyment, pleasure, health, performance. The International Labour Organization has shown that with poor food habits, production can be dwindled by 20%. It's a political issue. Bear witness what happened in Ukraine with war in Ukraine and food sovereignty. And for me, this is one of the key bonds with the planet and the challenges for the planet, because the future of the planet is being played out in our plates, something that we don't talk about a lot. But there are two paradoxes. There are more than 800 million people in the world who cannot eat properly. And from the fork to the plate, we waste 1/3 of what we produce. So that's outrageous. There are some people who can't eat properly, and there are the people who waste food. And if we cast a future-oriented diet, 2050, more than 10 billion people on the planet, production will have to increase to the tune of 50% or 60%. If you consider greenhouse gas emissions stemming from the different sectors involved in the food business, it's more than 1/3. So I think that this is a topic that we need to take on board. There's another dimension that we need to consider in France and in other countries: inflationary pressures. Food inflation was quite high in some countries, and paradoxically, the value of food is not enough recognized and acknowledged, because we continue to waste. We pay a high price, but we continue to waste. So we need to solve that kind of equation. There's a third paradoxical point that I would like to touch upon. Of course, we want to reduce the use of some foods in order to get a more healthy and sustainable food strategy. But in some countries, and especially if you consider animal proteins, in some countries such as Brazil or China, this type of food based on animal protein will make it possible for people to have a better social status. So there are differences between one country to another. So how do we go about that? How can we square the circle? I think that the situation differs because we are in 50 countries and we serve 5 billion consumers in the world. And there are different countries and different strategies. I was in India a month ago. In India, 90% of food is plant-based or vegetable-based. So it's part and parcel of their culture. So when I traveled to India, I ate very well and maybe too much. So in India, what is at stake is how do we prepare food regarding energy. How can we use other methods in order to have a more sustainable vegetable-based diet with more sophisticated means of production. So in Brazil, I haven't yet visited Brazil recently, but I will go to Brazil very shortly. In Brazil, if you consider the food patterns, you have lots of animal proteins. Beef is very important in the food habits of people. It's part and parcel of their culture. But for energy, they are using hydroelectricity, so they are a step ahead. So with all these examples, the issues and questions vary from one country to another. That's something that we need to take account if we want to come up with solutions. There's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all strategy. We need to set some objectives and we need to gauge. So when you want to make headway, you need to get targets and you need to measure those targets. This is what we started in 2017 at Sodexo. We wanted to reduce carbon emissions by 2025 by 34%. In 2022, the figure was 22%. We hope that we'll be able to reach the target of 34% in 2025. But we want to go further. 2025 is just around the corner. We need to set some targets for 2030, 2040, and a few months ago, we, by the way, we target lots of people, so we want to achieve a net zero target by 2040. So all the players should be involved, but at Sodexo, we have scopes 1 and 2. 1% of emissions are direct emissions, but scope 3, i.e. the indirect emissions, 99%. We, as a company, we won't be able to do it alone. We'll have to work with our suppliers, providers, customers, with our consumers, with local authorities, with associations, with public authorities. Cooperation is key if we want to achieve our objectives. There's another point that is quite pivotal. We've talked about constraints. I think that we won't be able to achieve our objectives with constraints. Quite the opposite. It's a matter of common sense. It's a matter of enjoyment, a matter of pleasure. So common sense, we talked about waste. Waste is a matter for all of us, producers, caterers, those involved in the catering industry. It has to do with the contracts that we signed with our customers. It depends on the behaviors and attitudes of our consumers. That's really important. It's a matter of measuring for a site when we have an objective, i.e. to reduce food waste. The figure can be 50% per site. So every day we gauge what we throw away. And I could provide you with some examples. And we can gauge our strides. So we've managed to achieve a drop of 40%, and then enjoyment, pleasure. Regarding food patterns, we shouldn't constrain people. People should enjoy eating. The Indians, they eat vegetable, plant-based foods. It's delicious. But this will bring about changes to the way we cook. We'll have to try new dishes that we were not used to eating, and all together we will do it. This is what I wanted to tell you. So we look forward to eating those new foodie meals. France Cavalier, you wanted to talk about food safety? Okay.
Hello, everybody. Thank you to the Cercle des Économistes and Akiko for this invite. Appreciate it. You can hear me? Yes. So the Akiko's introduction showed what was at stake for food safety, sustainable food safety, and I would like to add the word for all, because sustainable food security is important socially speaking. And we'll talk about inequalities, nutritional and food inequalities in the context of France. I'll talk about public policies in terms of foodstuff, whether for consumption or food help. So in terms of consumption for public policies, they are the nutritional information policies. We know they're not very efficient. They don't act on inequalities because, in fact, the information, messages are more readily accepted and used and implemented by the most educated households. But in the more modest households, there is a defiance with a view to governmental information and messages. Like Akiko said, the messages of the health and nutrition organizations, they encourage the consumption of fruit and vegetable, which are represent an expenditure that is too high for lower budgets. And moreover, the PNNS recommends consuming partly organic vegetable and fruit, and that's even more an issue in terms of prices. When we talk about price policies, which are being debated over today, the prices policies create a greater fracture because a virtuous approach would correspond to subsidize the products and tax the bad products with a view to their impact on health. And simulations carried out in France show that subsidizing fruit and vegetable boils down to favoring the more comfortable households or the highest revenue households. But if you tax fat and sweet products, insofar as it's a pretty big chunk of the budget of the low-income houses, well, this has an impact, a negative impact on their budget. And so, in the end, these policies aggravate the social policies with this principle of taxation, because if we don't have accompanying measures, otherwise we don't see how the most humble households will manage to meet this goal and not be impacted by this kind of policies. Now, if we talk about public policies for food subsidies based on the distribution of foodstuff, there's a weak role of the state because the state delegates the management distribution of the foodstuff to non-profit organizations and volunteer workers. But there is a paradoxical association between the fight against waste and food assistance, because the Garot law orients the waste or the non-consumed products to food help. We know that this aid is insufficient, it's unbalanced, nutritionally speaking. In terms of human rights, there is an asymmetrical relationship between the beneficiary and the donator, so there's a question of dignity here. And the important point is there is no evaluation or assessment of the environmental impact of these activities. So these are policies that are solely concentrated on the nutritional aspects. So with a view to these policies and limits, I think we have to give more thought to a more global type of system concerning the entire population, with two aspects, one curative aspect and one preventive aspect. For the curative aspect, I think there should be food aid targeted to the most unfavored populations, but restricted to the emergency cases with a modernized approach, taking into account the limits, and a more global approach supported by the Social Security of food, a universal allocation dedicated to sustainable foodstuffs, focused on products that are the subject of an agreement handled by the territories. The organization funding would be the same as Social Security systems, see if the tax system could play a role in there in a better context of food democracy. So it's a universal system that entails no discriminations and plays a preventive role when it comes to food security. So these are the principles for a sustainable food supply that applies to all. Thank you, France Correa. Philippe, you're the Director General of the Avril Group, and your reason of being is to serve the earth. With the first mission is a respectful agriculture for the planet. Can you talk to us within the scope of this debate? Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. Our mission, in fact, was set 40 years ago. We are a company who's owned by farmers, and we develop oils and proteins to feed humans and animals while preserving the planet. So that was stated 40 years ago. So preliminary remarks I would like to make before talking about examples, concrete examples. When we talk about healthy diet and sustainable food production, two things: quantity and quality. Quantity, there's one figure you should have in mind. Last year, the food consumption dropped by 4.6%. It means that all the French don't have enough food. So the basic of a sound food diet is to have a sufficient quantity of food and a quality food. And talk about quality, 60% are overweight in France. And so we are, this is a food quality issue that affects health. And there's a real challenge for health. Now, if we broaden all this, looking outside of France, there's something that's quite interesting to note. We'll go back on this during our debates, because there's no limit, no more border when it comes to prices of foodstuff. You have the South, which is witness to a demographic explosion. Countries of the South has a standard of living that will increase, so more people, more money in the household. So it means that you will have a transition, maybe not in India, but a transition from vegetable to animals. In the North, essentially in Europe, it's the opposite. We will eat less meat, less red meat, less beef, more white meat, eventually fish. That's the case for Europe. So there's a transition between animal and vegetable. But the key topic here is there are more people in the South than in the North. So we'll have to produce more, better quality products. If you take the 10 last years and 10 in the coming years, we will have to increase the production of vegetable protein by 30%, 35% for animal protein. So we'll have to think of new models that correspond to quality and needed quality and quantity, and work from the upstream to downstream. So I have examples, plenty of examples, but I'd like to mention two cases on the food quality. You saw in the introduction, we have to eat more vegetables, and we have to be able to produce them in France. And the Avril Group, we are the #1 producer of vegetables. But you know how much vegetable are produced in France? Lentils, 20%, chickpeas, 20%. There's no reason. Our climate is perfect for this kind of production. But the seeds of lentils date back to 1967 because there was no research. No research because we had no volumes. And so no production that justified funding this research for new seeds. At Avril, we are working hard and investing hard to develop these sectors. It corresponds to our objectives. So vegetable is a crucial challenge, but before convincing consumers to consume them, well, we have to produce these products in France. Second thing we can do that we've started to do within the Avril is on sustainability. talk about animal breeding, a lot of criticisms. But you see, we need to produce more. So we can say we need to have less livestock in France, but the meat consumption is not lowered in France. The figures are always the same. We still consume as much animal meat as we did. So we lost 9–10% of cattle in France. So it started in France, but the consumption doesn't drop. So it means that we import, and we import in production methods that are done elsewhere in the world. They're not as respectful as what we do in France for the environment. So at Avril, we've lowered by 15% our carbon emissions for cattle raising, and 15% is something concrete, and it's in the defense of our French cattle breeding. And I would go by saying that in another sector, another field, which is the on the vegetable products, I'll give an example that is virtuous, but we can ask producers. It's agriculture captures carbon. You have to be aware of this, and of course this will ensure the sustainability of our food production. So we have a system where we manage to pull out what I hear too much, the polluter payer. Polluter payer doesn't do anything for the planet. We have to find a virtuous system where virtue is paid for, or is. And we are working on another system for the colza producers. The colza can be transformed in energy. When you transform the colza in energy, is the byproduct of the protein. You save 60% in greenhouse gases. So if the farmer, his practices improves what he does by using less fertilizers, by not as deep furrows, well, this is something that can give us a lot of gains, 70%, 80% of lowered carbon emissions. So the farmer will be paid more because the seed will be more sustainable. That's the systems we have to develop. Otherwise, we won't manage. Taxes, compensations by the state, doesn't work. We have to find virtuous systems. We have one, we have to find other systems. So thank you. Jean-Philippe Puig, thank you. Aziz Bouchba, you're a farmer, agriculture. You are president for sustainable agriculture in Tunisia. So for you, we can do sustainable farming that preserves the planet. I don't know. Yes, you can hear me. So for us, in our association, which is called the Association for Sustainable Agriculture, we have adopted this sustainability approach since 2006 by adopting conservation agriculture methods. So this approach, which allows to adapt to climate change, to capture carbon, and enable some of our agricultures or farmers to adhere to preserve their soil capital, because sustainable agriculture involves having a sustainable support. And the soil that was mistreated for a long time, badly treated, with deep furrows, with the use of extensive use of fertilizers, chemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides, and all this. This has shown that its limits. In the last decade, we've been witness to the impacts of climate change, and which have had a very negative impact in the countries of South Mediterranean. This leads to think that this will also happen in France in the near future. I don't think that France is well suited or prepared to meet this challenge, and has not chosen to be inspired by what we do in the countries of the South Mediterranean. when we think of 2 degrees by 2050, no, 2.5 degrees in temperature rise in 2023, so we can see what we're going to be faced with. So we recommend an agricultural approach which is based on techniques that preserve the soil to make sure that this soil makes the rainwater available for the vegetables and exactly what the plant needs. And I think these techniques are at the basis of the health of the vegetation, and the health of the vegetation provides a healthy food. So that's our reasoning. We shouldn't talk of healthy food downstream at the level of the consumer, but rather upstream at the level of the farm, and that's what determines the quality of the foodstuff. So in our different approaches to regenerate the soils, we're a signatory and founders of the initiative Cape for 1,000, I think, from the COP21 in Paris. We're founding members of this initiative, but we take part in agroecological groups that work at raising the awareness of farmers, the importance of life in the soils, and make the final consumer aware that a living soil is the sole guarantee of a sound food production. In our association, we adopted, along with the French cooperation with the Avril Group, we've introduced the production of colza in Tunisia. It's a culture that represents a strong biomass. 70% of the biomass is re-injected in the soil, the residues of the crops, and of course contribute to enrich the soil in organic material, a soil that was degraded, that did not enable to produce cereals anymore. And we've introduced with our farmers this notion of rotations in the cereal crop production, ensuring the health of the soil, and of course a good production of oil with colza, and a production of vegetable oil, which enables to contribute in Tunisia, a country that used to be an importer of all these products, to produce locally. So it's an experience that in 10 years has helped to improve the organic content of the soils at more than 2%. So those who adhere to this approach benefit from a great contribution in organic material, over 60,000 hectares. We started in 2014 with this experience that's continuing. So we are enriching the soils. And this led to improve the quality of the soils and reinstore life in the soils. And we also started since 2006 conservation farming. So now we're at more than 100,000 hectares of land that benefit from this conservation agricultural techniques, capturing carbon, and also working to fight against climate change. Thank you.
So we touched upon meat consumption, red meat consumption, beef consumption, and there are lots of issues straddling health, environment issues. Mrs. Bayon, you talked about people being enthusiastic about meat consumption. You have Brazil and India in your corporate restaurants. How do you foster eating practices with less red meat? You're right. I mean, from one country to another, food patterns differ. Having said that, as Jean-Philippe said, in the southern part of the world, animal proteins, i.e. red meat, are being consumed quite a lot. For France, it accounts for 40% of our emissions, so it's a significant issue. But in the countries of the north, people tend to eat less meat. Of course, we don't want to discontinue meat production. It is not in line with people's wishes. So we were in a collective catering approach, but it's different. It is more personalized. I mean, people want to eat what they want. So it's a matter of awareness. You have some consumers who want to eat well. They want to change things. During COVID, we've witnessed that food boils down to health. So there are some teams who like to work together away from homework, because when people are together, this creates a balance. So what do we eat? What is the impact on the planet? We need to change recipes. In public hospitals in New York, for example, the hospitals in New York are a customer. They have their meat-free meals, vegetable-based meals. They are very happy, and they talked about that on the social network, and it created a buzz. And in France and in Europe, people told us, okay, you have a program in New York with hospitals, so why don't do that in France and in Europe? There are different sectors. Regarding vegetable and plant-based production, you talked about lentils. So before, we didn't buy lentils in France. So for the past 2 years, we recreated some French businesses, outlets, healthy products, good for health, but good for the planet. So we need to work differently in a matter of 2 years. Unlike what happened before, we want to make sure that we buy lentils in France. So you have different countries, hence different solutions, but we know what is the target. Jean-Philippe Puig, you've talked about the Earth. Do you think that the Earth will be able to sustain consumption patterns in the South? Maybe we'll have to be more radical. We need to focus on consumption. Yes, it is at stake. We know that there won't be a shortage of oil, but there will be a shortage of proteins. That's a key challenge, but we have a very European and French approach. Our transition is well advanced, but you can ask the countries of the South to eat less meat and to eat less red meat. That's not possible. It won't happen. Remember what happened to us in the past. Purchasing power has increased, and people started to eat a lot of meat, and that's the case now in the countries of the South. So we can make sure that we can reduce the consumption of methane. And what is the rate regarding methane emissions? We tend to focus on food. Methane is released into the atmosphere. So we are working on food patterns, but we can go even further. Consumers, you can't ban a consumer from eating meat. That's impossible. So when you make a purchasing decision, the first one is very easy. There's something new, so you will try. But the second purchasing action is much more difficult. So we need to convince consumers that proteins are good, certainly better than meat, but we haven't reached that objective. So altogether, at the end of the day, proteins are good. Proteins will help me to meet my protein requirements. And I want to consume proteins because my culture has changed and we have excellent products. So Le Sieur has launched vegetable and plant-based products, but I hope that the consumers will adopt these products in the long term. So, Claire, what can you tell us? Allow me to touch on what Sophie Bellon said. Collective catering is accessible to all. It is ideal when you want to deliver nutritional information, especially when you eat. And with nutritional information, you can come up with a scalable pricing approach. It's a very interesting tool for everybody. In France, there's a proposal whereby catering conditions should be extended, and the fact that people can extend eating hours. I'm told that this is almost the end of this roundtable. What is the future of healthy and sustainable eating approach? So we have producers, we have manufacturers, we have research representatives, public authorities, citizens, and we have the caterers. And the first point is that we are all accountable to food changes. I won't be able to do it alone. My company won't be able to do it alone. So we need to work together. We have some common issues. That's very important. Second, sustainability should be desirable. We're not going to constrain people. It's not a matter of meting out penalties to people. We won't make it if we constrain people. Vegetable-based meals should be desirable and foodie. So foodiness will save the planet, but not constraints. France, in one word, what can you tell us? So allow me to flag up 2 points. Of course, there are some nutritional and food inequalities, and I need to combat them. So if you consider the food and health policy, inequalities are not taken into account as part of these sustainable, healthy, long-term diets. A universal system could help us implementing sustainable food diets. We are dealing with a significant cultural change. So the consumers, they call the shots. So we'll be working with the farmers. But consumers should be able to like our foods. But what is important is information. It has to start from school. Education is key. So we need to educate people, young people, to raise awareness. We need to rely on public policies at school in order to foster healthy and sustainable diet and food. These policies have already yielded some results in our country, in France. So intentional public policies should be implemented in order to embark upon this transition quickly. Thanks a lot to... So foodiness is key. virtues are key to remunerate virtues for everybody for the transition to a sustainable food approach. So this has to do with green transition being a matter for all of us. Thanks a lot.